I want to kick off with a stat. Standish Group has done research, reaching out to IT and really asked sort of, the project success rates in the industry, right? And they put 31.1% of projects will be canceled before they ever get completed. Right? And then the other stat that was sort of interesting was 52.7% of projects will cost 189% over their original estimates, right? Sounds familiar, because that's sort of the nature of enterprise software. I mean, it feels often that software projects take forever to install, and we've had a history in the software industry of trying to go with the .0 version. Stuff doesn't work, and you're like, okay, no, I'm never going to put a .0 version on. I want a .1, .2, .3. And I think we've been through that journey, and there's a lot of pain there. And we hope that with Tableau Server, with a little bit of planning, you don't have to go through that kind of pain. And hopefully what we cover today will help you sort of work through that. My name is Nilesh Kamkolkar, and I'm crazy about Tableau no matter where I am. That was on top of Shangri-La in the Zanskar range, 16,300 feet or something like that. That's me on the right with the blue cap, with a guide. And that was the sort of the spot where we had to send 3/4 of our supplies back because the weather was getting crappy. So we sort of trudged on forward. If you want to find out what happened after that, you can find me over a beer at the party tonight. But I'm here today and very excited to be here today with Alan, who is the Director of Server and Platform Engineering. Alan and his team are responsible for the server platform, and they're building out the Tableau platform as well, right? He's leading the team that is bringing Linux and some of the other technologies we'll talk about later today as well. Alan, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, Nilesh. So I'm Alan Dorhofer, like Nilesh said. I'm super glad to be here talking to you today. I'm the director of what we call the Server and Cloud Platform Development Team at Tableau, and that includes installation platform behind Tableau Server. And I couldn't be happier to be here, and I also feel very lucky to be talking with Nilesh, who's been worn a whole bunch of hats at Tableau for many years. He's been a PM for enterprise product development for over 3 years. You've done SAML integration, Kerberos integration. You've run the entire Scalability development program and white paper. So we're super lucky to have Nilesh here speaking. So great to be with you.
Cool. Thanks, Alan. We thought we'll just start by going over what's new. There's a lot of new stuff coming in to Tableau. A great place for you to find out if you're not at the conference is our website. So we'll go quickly through the things that are coming out new in 10.4 and 10.5 beta that was announced, and then sort of put that in context and talk about planning and deployment, and then cover a couple of case studies architecture-wise. Okay. It is updating. Okay. Well, that's weird. Okay. Well, PowerPoint blues. Okay, so this is what we thought we'll do. So there's a ton of stuff in 10.4 that is new. I won't be able to go through all the details. There are a ton of Tableau labs. Developers are here across the conference. You'll be able to go deeper into these topics. But we released data source certification. You saw that in the keynote yesterday. Commenting and discussions, allowing you to have more collaboration across team members. Recommendations, we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth today. Ability to publish to older versions of Tableau Server, Okta Mobile Connect. So really, again, bringing the mobile and the authentication and connectivity all together into the platform. In 10.5, we continue to invest in access to data because one of our principles is really people should have access to data no matter where it is. It's in the cloud, it's on files, it's in cubes, it doesn't matter. Big data, small data, we want you to have access to it. So we continue to invest a lot in bringing these connectors, and the box connector is one of those new ones that we've added. And we continue to add these along the way during the year as well. Added improvements in the administration and management side of it, which is having the ability to automatically activate desktops at install time instead of an end user downloading desktop and then calling you for, hey, I need to activate this. So really just taking that friction out. And we also added a lot of subscription improvements. Subscription, for those of you that are new, is the ability to send a viz in email to whoever you want. We had the ability to subscribe others in the earlier version of the product. And then now, new, we're adding the ability to subscribe a DL, or a group within Tableau Server. So you can sort of think of this as taking a report and sending it out to everybody, except that in the email you have a link to the viz that'll get you the live viz, and you can interact with it, right? And then we continue to expand support for mobile with support for mobile device management for BlackBerries. Also added proxy authentication for mobile apps. So the mobile app earlier, if you had a reverse proxy, it couldn't authenticate. So we fixed that. So if you have users using mobile apps, having proxies in your environment will continue to work. You saw nested projects earlier in the keynote. This was a huge ask by many of you in this room and through the entire server admin community. The ability to really have projects that are nested within each other and have permissions. And for those of you that are new, project permissions, and I think Alan is going to touch a little bit on this as well, but you have the flexibility in the architecture to have a deployment that caters to regulated compliance projects where you need things a little bit locked down from a compliance perspective. And then you also have the flexibility to have sandboxes. And nested projects sort of gives you a lot more flexibility in that same direction. And then we added compatibility. This is what you saw earlier in the keynote, being able to share newer versions of Tableau vizzes with somebody that's using an older version of desktop. Like if you have 5,000 users in your enterprise, not everybody is up to downloading the new version, right? If you have 10 or 20 of the core guys downloading the new versions and sharing things over with the folks that have older versions of desktop, they can still continue to look at the viz. And of course, the same thing works on publish as well. Server on Linux. This is Alan's baby in lots of ways. Of course, for Linux, we had for authentication, we need to support LDAP, so that support comes in. If you're using traditional identity management systems like Ping Federate or SiteMinder or any of those, a SAML is a good way to just even leverage authentication. I think there's a session on authentication that goes deeper into it. But this brings enterprise authentication to Linux as well, which is a new product. And we're introducing Tableau Services Manager, which is from the browser being able to manage and administer your server, which really opens up the door for you to deploy a server in the cloud or on-premise and have a mix of these, sort of depending on your situation.
And just a note on that, the browser portion of that, the UI is coming in the next release. So this initial version of Linux is a command line tool that uses TSM as well as APIs, and then the browser-based UI will be coming up in the next quarter, we hope.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. And the approach we're taking is really to expose everything via REST APIs, right? So you have a set of REST APIs and you build on top of it, and you'll see that through the whole product architecture as well. Dynamic topology, server changes. This is TSM scripting. So you saw this where you can essentially via command line change the number of backgrounders or VisQL servers that you want. And again, we can talk offline about specific deployment situations you might have, but the idea most often, right, is if you have one single box that you're dedicating to Tableau Server, there is work that's happening on there that is user-facing. This is the VisQL server, right? This is servicing the end user. And there's work happening on there, which are things like refreshing data, like extracts and running subscriptions. And this is not necessarily user-facing, but it's background work. So they often tend to compete for the same resources. Having the ability to spread that out across workers and also be able to dynamically change the processes at runtime without needing a server restart really makes the availability much higher for server as well. You've all seen Hyper. We're very excited about it. It's going to bring a fast data analysis for larger data sets and also improved scalability. We're still in beta, so we're really not ready to talk about exactly what those scale numbers are going to be because we would love for you guys to download it, install it, play with it, and give us feedback. I mean, we want to hear from you guys how things are working for you.
But you can
yeah.
download the 10.5 beta today, and
Yep.
that is running Hyper. And in fact, the Linux version of the beta, which is the 4th Linux beta, is also running Hyper, so you can play with it today.
Yeah, please give us feedback. But we do see Hyper bringing in a lot more scalability to the platform. And of course, with the extract refreshes being really fast, it means you can service your end users with the most fresh data that's out there. If your extract refreshes are taking a half hour or an hour, depending on the size and the complexity of your data and joins, Hyper really makes that go very fast. Quick thing here, like you see, basically, when you go to Hyper, you'll see a new process like Hyper here. You just don't see data engine anywhere, right? So essentially, think of this as sort of the next generation of data engine. And you'll be able to do the same kind of things you do with data engine. Few things on sort of where you need the Hyper processes. And as we get out of the beta and get close to release on this, you will hear a ton more about this, right? So these are sort of constructs, and things might evolve as we learn during the beta, which we inevitably do. But typically, every time in the architecture, we need to spawn a TDE process. This is the old data engine process. And for those of you that are new, the data engine is basically the in-memory engine where we're storing the extracts and querying the extracts in memory, right? Wherever that particular component is needed, whether it's visible or we spawn it architecturally behind the scenes, you will need an instance of Hyper, right? For example, the background responds to TDE when it's trying to do an extract refresh. You may not see it unless you're specifically looking for it. But that necessitates a Hyper process on the backgrounder machine, right? So these are things that you'll start to see. We'll talk more about as things get more clearer through the beta and also our testing as well. Recommendations. We've talked about recommendations a lot. This has been out in the product for a while. We've been incrementally releasing our machine learning recommendation capabilities. We released table recommendations first, then we added join recommendations, and then most recently, we released the data source recommendations, right? So this is more of a microservice architecture that starts to build on top of what we have. Here, you're essentially looking at the recommendation service and a training service. The training service is basically looking at the users in the system. This is all information that's in Postgres, right? The TWIBXs and the data sources and the workbooks, and how they're connecting. So it leverages the data model from published data sources that you have on server, understands how people are using that, how popular they are, which data sources the workbooks are connected to, and building that, and using that to build a recommendation model, which basically bubbles up as a list of recommendations for you guys, right? So a lot of times, this is useful if you have end users creating data that looks similar to somebody else that just did it, right? So sort of hopefully, as your deployment grows, these algorithms will do better and better. So if you just have one data source and not a lot of users, this is not really a thing from a data source perspective that you would want. But from a table and a join perspective, when you're using desktop, this can be very valuable, right? So we talked about, and there's a ton of new stuff coming in, right? But I think let's put all of this in context and think about what does it mean for deployment, and how does that evolve. And then mind you, like this, we're still in beta, so as we get out of beta, we will be able to update this. But Alan, why don't we talk a little bit more about deployment?
Yeah, thanks, Neelish. So Neelish just gave you a great survey of kind of some of the major new features that have come out in 10.4 and that will be coming out in 10.5 that we thought would be particularly applicable to administrators of Tableau Server. But I know a lot of you are brand new since you raised your hands. So I'm going to kind of dive into what does deploying Tableau Server, what do you have to think about? What are all the factors? What are the main kind of categories of thought processes and planning that need to go in when you're deploying Tableau Server, whether it's on a single machine or a 2 or 3 node cluster, or quite a large deployment that you're expecting to serve up thousands of people in your enterprise. So we'll talk about both of those scenarios. So kind of the first category I suggest you think about is to understand how Tableau Server stores content, kind of the physical and logical abstractions of how we organize and manage content. And so the first thing to think about is you have the concept of a server cluster, which might be literally just a machine of one machine, so it's not really a cluster. Or you might have a large cluster of 8 or more machines, and in that case, we call them workers. That's kind of our terminology. So you could have 1 or more workers. And then once you log into that cluster as a user, if you're going to use this concept we call Tableau Server sites, your user will need to choose which site they're going to log into. And that's the topmost abstraction of content silos, so to speak. So a site, think of it as a silo for content. And oftentimes we find that companies will devote things like the finance team has their own site. Sales has their own site, or you can kind of think of them as logical Tableau servers running within the cluster. So you log into that site, site A or site for finance, you log into finance, and those users will not see the content that the marketing team's site has, and that's by design. We do not have provide the ability for workbooks to be shared across sites because those are literally our unit of multi-tenancy, so to speak. So that's kind of where it all starts. And you can some people want to use sites, some companies do. Some people instead like to rely on projects, which is the next level of content hierarchy.
And
so,
Alan, Tableau Online uses sites as well.
That's right. So when you sign up for a Tableau Online account, your company, you as a user and your company is given your own dedicated site. So that's a good example of how we use sites. And so once you log into a site, or just the default site if you're not using them, then you have this way to organize all content within projects. So projects are sort of like folders on a file system, like in Windows or Mac. And you can put workbooks in projects. And of course, workbooks themselves have sheets or dashboards, just like if you know Tableau at all, that's the kind of the model for visualizations and how content is structured within a workbook. But you can also store shared data sources within a project, and new in 10.5, right? Nested projects, or did it come out in 10.4? 10.5, yeah, upcoming in 10.5 is the ability to store other projects within projects, which as Nilesh mentioned, is a feature request that people like yourselves have been asking for a very long time, because once you can do that, you can really have a very flexible organizational model. So instead of having a site for finance, for example, finance will have potentially a project. And within finance's project, there are a bunch of sub-projects, for example. And I'll get into how permissions work in that in terms of projects and everything else in Tableau in a second here.
Alan, this seems like probably a good place where IT and business can sit down together and find out what the data security needs are, right? Maybe there's a group at a company where it's an open culture, open data culture. They don't really need sites.
That's right.
And maybe there's specific requirements where you have a particular group and then contractors that are outside the company that don't need access to it. So maybe sites is a good example. So I think this is a good conducive sort of a topic to sit down with your business folks or figure out the business requirements in terms of how you want to figure out content. I always feel like if you sort of invest completely in sites, then going from sites to projects is kind of tricky, and then projects to sites.
Absolutely true.
So
giving this a lot of forethought is a great idea. So being proactive in your planning and having those discussions with your business units to see what they really want and to give them the options of what's available in Tableau Server is a good way to make sure that this project is successful, alluding back to what Nilesh talked about at the very beginning. So like I mentioned, you can also store within projects shared data sources, and those data sources can be published to server, and you can see, just like in Tableau Desktop, filters available within those data sources, aliases, and we'll get into that a little bit more as well. So once you figure out the content model, how you want to structure your content, and you can see what's available, then the next thing to think about when you're planning your deployment is how you want to either give access to those projects or those workbooks or lock down those projects. So permissions. Tableau Server supports a rich set of permissions, sort of analogous to if you're familiar with the Active Directory or Windows file system, the way you can provide read or read and write access to individual files, to individual folders, and that sort of works at the top level, and that will propagate down to the lower level. All that applies to Tableau Server too. So you can literally make a workbook, publish it, and allow only one user to see that, but it's within a project, for example, that everyone can have access to. Or you can set up a project to be a sort of a permission template, which is only visible, writable, or readable by the finance team, for example, or a certain subgroup within finance. And then once you publish content to that project, that content will take those permissions. That's one good example. You can integrate your Tableau Server authentication-wise with things like your Active Directory store. Nilesh mentioned when we rolled out Linux here, in which it's in beta now, we also added support for LDAP authentication stores as well. And that won't just be for Linux. Once we release the Tableau Services Manager for Windows, hopefully early next year, that will also be an option for Windows users if your company uses LDAP. I mentioned the ability to lock down permissions by project. That's really useful. The other thing to keep in mind is making this choice between kind of this open sandbox approach for a given project or a site versus a more locked down governed approach. So we have some companies that literally use Tableau Server as this wide open sandbox that's by design completely self-service, and everyone can access all data. But we fully realize that doesn't work for many companies. That's kind of a culture of, wait, everyone can see everything that's in there? That doesn't work for us. And that's okay. We support both models. So you literally can set up a project that is completely open in one case, and another project or set of projects that is completely shut down. So you have the flexibility to do all that.
Yeah, I think one example, Alan, that I was meeting a customer on the East Coast. They'd done something pretty interesting. We're not going to go deep into REST APIs here, but if you aren't familiar with REST APIs, there's sessions that I think you should join. But they were using essentially REST APIs. If I was a line of business user and I came to Robert and I say, hey Robert, I need to get onto Tableau Server that you have, right? A lot of times what happens is a quick discussion there, and they figure out either through a document or some little process whether this needs to be under compliance, regulation from a data perspective, or it's like, I want it open, I want Alan, everybody, my team to see the data, right? And then Robert would basically use a set of REST APIs to automatically provision an entire project, and if it's a site by choice, right, a site or a project, have some sample content on there so I can get started, my team can get started. So all of that was sort of almost self-provisioning that would happen for self-service projects just via REST API. And it's a push of a button, and everybody just has the content to get going, right? So there's a lot of potential in terms of how you go about governed compliance requirements and then self-service as well. And then if it's a compliance project, you pretty much would create a site that's isolated, have one project in there, lock down the permissions, and all of this can be driven through an API, right? So you create the API, and you can have the peace of mind that whatever permissions are on the top level project are the permissions that everything underneath is going to have. A user cannot override those project level permissions, right? So that was one example of how one of the customers was using it, and I'm sure you'll come up with your own ways of using this flexibility.
Thanks, Nilesh. Yeah, it's a good point. So also, I mentioned nested projects before. So keep in mind that with nested projects, a sub-project can have different permissions from the parent project, or you can choose to use the parent project permissions all the way down. It's your choice. So you get a lot of flexibility there. Another important thing to note is those shared data sources I mentioned, which are a really powerful tool for governance for data. So imagine publishing a data source which becomes the data source of record for the sales data, or the data source of record for finance. And that's locked down in a certain way or exposed in a certain way through permissions. So the same types of permissions you can apply to workbooks can be applied to data sources as well. So if only that team can access that data source, you can set that up in Tableau Server. There are also some roles available in Tableau Server for administrative users, people who can set these permissions I've been talking about. So by default, there's a system-wide server administrator, which can essentially do anything. And you can have as many of those as you want. That's the initial user you create when you install Tableau Server, in fact. And then if you have sites, you can also designate users to be administrators who have full content administration privileges on an entire site. And then you can also do something similar to individual products. And then lastly, the owner of a workbook, who is the person who published the workbook, can also set permissions on their own content. Data connectivity is another aspect, a very important aspect of thinking about deployment when you're planning. So what data do you expect your Tableau server to connect to? Where is that data? And how are you expecting your users to access it? So I've mentioned a few times already this concept of shared data sources. We recommend you look into that. That's a very powerful thing because if you publish a data source, for example, a data source could be a connection to SQL Server or a connection to Oracle. You can publish that data source and it would connect to a particular database, a particular set of tables that you may have done some pre-joins on. Or users have. And the great thing about that is you can name it a certain thing. You can provide access to the right groups for that. You can set up aliases for columns that may be oddly named, like column number 753. You can call that actually profit or what have you, and to make it meaningful, sort of like a data dictionary. And this is a very, very powerful governance concept as far as accessing data. So that's one way you can use, your server users can access data. So they would use Tableau Desktop or publish visualizations that would interact with the shared data source on Tableau Server. And Tableau Server would be proxying the connection through to SQL Server or Oracle. So only Tableau Server in that case would require the SQL Server drivers to be installed or the Oracle drivers. Your desktop users wouldn't need that. So that's kind of the two things to think about. It's shared data sources are not only a way to govern data sources, but they're also essentially a proxy to the root data source. Very powerful. The other common ways are literally just workbooks that access data directly. So if you create a Tableau workbook in Tableau Desktop and it directly accesses your PostgreSQL or your Oracle or your Excel spreadsheet, you can publish that to Tableau Server, and that workbook, when it's being served up by Tableau Server, will also directly access that SQL Server. So you have to think about, from a network permissions level, can Tableau Server see the SQL Server? Are the firewall rules in place to allow that access, authentication? So things like that you have to think about during deployment.
What about data gravity, Alan? Like, can I have my data in India somewhere and server be in California somewhere?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And you know, we have what we call a hybrid data model. It's extremely flexible. We recommend that you think about where your data is and where Tableau Server is, because the further away Tableau Server is from your data source, the longer the network latency. And so if you're doing these large queries that return just millions of tuples of data, you may have performance issues. So we do data gravity is kind of this concept of trying to get the client that's accessing the data, which in this case might be Tableau Server, as close to that data as possible. So for example, if you deploy Tableau Server to the cloud, maybe AWS and Amazon, and one of your common data sources is Amazon Redshift in AWS, that's great data gravity, because right there your nodes running Tableau Server are probably in Amazon data centers that are right next to Redshift, and you're going to have great low latency access. So same concept goes for an on-premise deployment to how far away is your SQL Server and that kind of thing.
I mean, it's technically feasible. Wouldn't recommend it.
Right.
So.
And then the other thing to think about is that you can do what we call extracts of data. So for those of you who've known Tableau Server, this is just an extract which you can run in desktop as well. And that's the concept of a workbook connects to something like SQL Server, and instead of every time you open and view that workbook having a direct connection to SQL Server, you've asked for that workbook to extract that data back into Tableau Desktop or into Tableau Server. And maybe it's just a subset of the data. Maybe you filtered it down or joined and pre-aggregated, but it's up to you. And once that data comes into Tableau, it becomes Tableau formatted data running either in 10.4 and prior, the Tableau data engine, or going forward, the Hyper data engine. And we recommend that in cases where it makes sense, where you want to shield your SQL Server or DB2 or Oracle or what have you from your direct access, use extracts. Where you find performance to those data sources is too slow going direct, use an extract. Tableau's extract formats are highly optimized and very fast, and with Hyper can support hundreds of millions of rows. And then another category to think about when you're planning deployments is self-service and governance. And I kind of touched on that a little bit in another slide. But that's really the concept of, fundamentally, are you going to deploy a Tableau Server cluster that is open and it really is aiming to provide self-service for everyone, and you expect your users to do everything themselves and set permissions and not worry too much about locking things down? Or are you going to have a highly governed lockdown scenario where your users have very controlled access, permissions are very strict, and only you only allow certain teams to see things? That's kind of a fundamental thing you should be discussing with your business before you do deployment. You do have the choice, like I keep saying, of mixing those models, and that's certainly what we do as well. But you just need to be aware of what your options are there. And then the next kind of area that's important to planning for deployment is when you might be wondering, how do I keep an eye on what's happening to my cluster once I do install it and get it deployed? So we have a whole bunch of options for monitoring and managing Tableau Server. Within the new Linux release, we have the new Tableau Services Manager that Nilesh mentioned before. This is an entirely new rewrite of the kind of administration of Tableau Server, an entirely new set of services that has command line tools available, REST API, you can see status, you can stop server, you can start server, you can add processes, you can configure it. We suggest you check out the Linux beta and check out Tableau Services Manager. It's quite powerful. And then we provide system-level monitoring. Built into Tableau Server, there's something we call the Server Resource Manager, which keeps an eye on process health and restarts processes that have used too much CPU for a certain amount of time or have used too much memory. If the system is running low on resources, Tableau Server tries to look after itself. But you can also get at detailed, rich internal information about how the processes are running by using JMX information. So JMX is a common Java-based perf metrics type of system health type information. And we have an open source tool, which I'd encourage you to check out, called Tabmon. If you just search for Tableau open source, you'll be directed to a Git page, which has a whole bunch of open source software, and Tabmon is one of the projects that kind of makes it very easy and to set up a powerful set of monitoring for a Tableau server that you can then visualize in Tableau desktop or in Tableau worksheets running on server. So I mentioned JMX. You've also got a whole rich set of logs that the applications are writing, which you can get to know if you want to know exactly what's happening in terms of visualizations being loaded, in terms of data server activity, in terms of our hyperdata engine writing, returning queries. You can see all that activity in the logs. With the next release, we have some great improvements in error categorization, more meaningful errors from things like data server. And then for those that require strict auditing and full awareness of what's happening, we have a set of audit tables inside our metadata database, which is actually Postgres, what we call the repository. And you can access those. You as an administrator can see all sorts of rich information about who logged in, when they logged in, what workbook did they access, when refresh is happening, when background refresh tasks are happening, and all sorts of activity. We also have a bunch of built-in administrative Tableau visualizations for administrators that show you some of that just out of the box, but then you can also access that and make custom views as well based on that auditing information and other tables available to administrators. And then lastly, before we jump into scalability here, you want to think about what options Tableau has for security. So security is one of the primary drivers of the development team for Tableau Server. We don't do anything unless it's secure, and it's the first thing we think about. So we have user security, infrastructure security, network security, and data security. And basically, these are things on the slide you see here that you would expect us to be thinking about. So I mentioned you can integrate with Active Directory as far as logging in. We also have a SAML integration for single sign-on scenarios. If you have a SAML provider, identity provider in your organization, you can integrate with that via SAML. We're always adding new functionality to data sources that Tableau connects to allow for row-level security. Through things like Kerberos. So that allows your users to log in to Tableau Server via a browser or desktop automatically their credentials, whether it's typically on an AD network, for example, are passed into Tableau Server. When they view a workbook, that their credentials are then automatically passed to that data source, like SQL Server, so that they can only access the rows that they have permissions to. So we have security that goes all the way through to the data source and back. And then, of course, we have basic infrastructure security that you'd expect. So you can configure the user, the operating system user that Tableau Server is running as, which we recommend you not run it as a highly privileged user. And by default, that's how we do it. And we in the new TSM, we call it Tableau Services Manager, we require a login to use the command line client and the REST API. So and it's all based on SSL client and server certificates, which, by the way, is another way that your users can access Tableau Server, which is via client certificates and PKI infrastructure if your company requires that. That kind of gives you the ability to use things like smart cards for desktop users. So we have a whole rich ecosystem for security, for authentication. So check out the help on that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Nilesh to talk about some of the ways that you can plan for scaling server up and out.
Cool, thanks, Alan. Yeah, I mean, the architecture is really flexible. We really thought deeply about how to leverage the investments IT's already made in the infrastructure and networks and all of that. So you have a lot of choice. On scalability, and I think I'm going to go through this a little faster so we keep the time, because I know you guys have to get to the next session as well. But for scalability, Tableau architecture is designed to scale up and scale out. We support millions of users in Tableau Public, and you heard Adam talk about the billion views to date on Tableau Public. So the architecture is very scalable. You can deploy it in a scalable way, either by scaling up or scaling out. Couple of elements when you think about scalability is, well, if workbooks don't perform well, so if the design of the workbooks is such that every workbook load takes 60 seconds, or you're just having the system wait for things to happen, right? So I think a good best practice is when you're designing workbooks, design them with performance in mind, so response time. And if you have good performing, and that there's a ton of literature out there in terms of how to do that. That's out of scope for this talk, but if you design your workbooks with perf in mind, scalability becomes easy, and these two things then become the key vectors, right? One is thinking about how frequently does your team use analytics to make business decisions. I mean, if it's a hobby kind of a project, I look at it once in 6 months and I never go back to it again, that's a different profile of users than, say, a team of 100 people that have to look at a queue of some sort. Like in Tableau, our support teams use Tableau to look at the customer calling list, right? So if they're looking at it very frequently and you want to refresh it very frequently and you're making decisions based on what's showing up on the viz, that's a pretty frequent use of analytics. So that sort of goes up and down vertically. And then the other axis is sort of looking at data freshness. This is the other workload, right? Which is extracting data from live databases and then bringing it back into Tableau as an extract. So extract refreshes tend to be a workload that also have a heavy need for resources from a scale perspective. And if you just break that down into low, moderate, high across both of these, you can start to see some similarities in use cases. And I can take this and pretty much, with a few questions, talking to the business people and IT people, figure out where you roughly fall into this, right? A lot of folks probably fall into the 5 to 6 grids, and there's no science to it. I mean, every scenario will be different. Doesn't have to map to this. I'm going to ask you to hold a question for 2 minutes because there's a lot of content. I want to make sure we cover that, and we'll be here, and we'll repeat this tomorrow as well. So on this, these are just examples, right? These aren't sort of set in stone, but depending on sort of what your scenario is, there are implications in terms of how caching kicks in for scalability, or how we run queries and things like that underneath the hood. So. With caching, when you have users that are using analysis very frequently, primarily as a read-only. So if you have a user base of 1,000 people that are just looking at a view, they're not doing anything with it, right? Think of that as like a read-only kind of a scenario. People are just looking at the view, and then maybe they walk away. They don't interact with it, they don't edit it, they don't do anything with it. In that kind of a mode, you're actually leveraging caching a lot more, because you run the query that you need for the viz, and then we put it in the external caching server, which is a cache for query results, right? And that is a good scenario where adding more cache servers might help you, right? But if you're sort of more on the place, if you're horizontally going more left to right, what you want to think about is backgrounder processes and how you want to deploy your backgrounder processes. So isolating these workloads is a good idea. And I know that it's not always, it's technically feasible, but there are business constraints in terms of how you think about the deployment as well. But if you can isolate them, isolating the backgrounder from the VizQL, which is the analytics workload, is a good idea. And of course, you're connecting live to a SQL Server database. Now, extracts, like as Hyper comes out, right, we find that Hyper is much faster in extract creation. So the backgrounder footprint, or the amount of resources Hyper would need will evolve. So we'll share that with you as we're ready to share that. Note that as we add more features, your backgrounder workload, there's more jobs running. Typically, we found about 30% of the workload that the backgrounder is running is our system-level workloads, right? Which is cleaning files and running vacuum analyze and Postgres DB for maintenance. These are mostly system kind of tasks. But the rest of the workload is what is done in lieu of a user wanting fresh data, like refreshing an extract, right? So that's fresh data. But we're, like the recommendation engine, for example, there's a job in there for training. So when you have recommendations enabled and you have the trainer running, there's more there that's running. So over time, backgrounders, you can expect backgrounders to be running more load. Just be cognizant of that as we add more features, right? Because that's one of the ways we do work that is outside of the end user interaction. Things to think about also, scaling with portals. We have tens of thousands of users. A lot of the user authentication that happens in the application server tier. So that is the component responsible for authentication and working with the backend components to make sure your user has the right cookies and sessions set up. Postgres isolation for a lot of content and users. I can run Tableau on a laptop, right? Because we made it very simple. But being simple doesn't mean it's simplistic. You have the flexibility of deploying it at a large scale enterprise. And when you have Postgres sort of on the same machine, a single machine deployment always starts to add contention for resources. So depending on your loads, you may want to consider moving Postgres to a different machine as well. I think these I'm going to skip. One thing to think about: physical versus virtual. A lot of customers ask us about what does it matter between physical and virtual. It depends. It depends on what your configuration is. Oftentimes, CPU reservation is an important concept in VMware, and I'm sure other hypervisor technologies have equivalent things. Consider a 60 to 80% reservation on CPU. Now, oftentimes when we have this conversation with IT, it's like 80% reservation. That's nuts, because I don't want to block that much CPU from other users, and that's not what that number means. The 80% reservation is literally prioritizing Tableau to have the cycles when Tableau asks for it, right? But that reservation number still will allow VMware to have that capacity be available to others. So there's some of that conversations you may want to have with your ESX administrators and working with them to have the right deployment. There's a very good white paper out there that you guys can take a look at.
Thanks, Neelish. So I'm going to just briefly, and then we'll go and jump into questions and wrap up here.
Yeah.
Just briefly show you what the architecture under the hood looks like. So we break it down into different levels. Content services being the top. Beneath the content processes that handle that sit our data services tier. Those are processes such as the ones responsible for serving up content for shared data sources. And then the content and data tier is supported by our storage tier. So we have processes that handle storing metadata about users like Postgres, and then we also have processes that manage extract data as well. And then, of course, that all sits on the underlying fabric, which things like Apache Web Server, which is what our gateway is, cluster coordination. We use things like Zookeeper to be the source of record for configuration and which nodes are doing what. So I won't go into the details because we don't have much time, but that's kind of the basic architecture there. And so some of the key processes to keep in mind: VizQL Server, that's what loads visualizations to users on Tableau Server. The application server, also called Viz Portal, is what users log into and browse around for content. Hyper, or TDE, is what's actually serving up extract queries. And then the repository I mentioned is literally Postgres server. The gateway is literally Apache Web Server. Couple of real-world case studies, and then we'll wrap up and take questions. So here, this is an actual customer of ours, a large bank. And this is a snapshot of the running workers in their cluster. So they have 8 machines total with that number of processes that you see there. You'll see a lot of the processes are serving up visualizations. Those are VizQL Server. And then a couple of the workers are dedicated to mainly what we call background refresh and subscription activity. Those are running backgrounder. And that's a good illustration of the flexible way you can deploy Tableau to isolate background activity from user interaction by putting backgrounders on workers dedicated to that, for example. And so this particular installation can serve up high level of concurrency to thousands of users. So this is a large one, but by no means do you need that for your system. A 2-3 machine cluster can also serve up many hundreds of users, and a single machine can actually serve up, if it's a powerful enough machine, quite a large user base. And so here's another real world scenario. This is an actual customer of ours that instead of scaling as largely out as the bank, they're kind of scaling up. So they have less machines, but each of those machines are very powerful. They're running, in some cases, hundreds of gigabytes of RAM, which is a good illustration that Tableau can use the amount of RAM you give it. The more RAM your machines have, the larger the data sets that your Tableau server will be able to work with in memory, and the better your performance will be. And so there's a couple examples. This particular case is deployed on VMware, which Nilesh just mentioned, which we fully support. You could also deploy it on the bare metal. You could deploy it to AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. We support all those scenarios. And with that, I'll skip over a couple of other interesting deployments here, but just know that you can deploy scenarios where you can have external authentication. Usually our internal data store is configured for users. And you can also embed content. We have APIs to embed visualizations in your own portal, for example. And there's application extensibility, which you may have seen at the keynote the other day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nilesh to wrap up.
Cool. Thanks, Alan. I think we're starting to eat into the Q&A time, but hopefully, I know it's a mixed room of new and existing users of server, but hopefully you've got a bunch of things that you can take back in terms of what you can do to plan the deployment better, right? It doesn't have to be a multi-million, multi-year services engagement from Tableau. You guys can do this just with a little bit of planning. Think about, there's a lot of new stuff coming down the pike as well. So if you're going to 10.4, all of the stuff that we have now, there's a lot of literature in terms of how you can plan your deployment. All of that is good and intact. If you're thinking about 10.5 with Hyper coming, Linux coming, these are newer platforms, right? So we're going to be over time releasing more information about how to think about these deployments and look out for those. And think about growth. I mean, this is one of the things that I often run into is, customers underestimate how quickly the end users want to get onboarded. I mean, they'll start with 100 users, and pretty soon they get to 1,000 and 3,000 and 10,000. That ramp is pretty fast. And if you're not in the cloud, hardware acquisition can take time. I mean, if you're on a 1-year budget cycle for buying hardware, plan ahead, right? And this often helps with that. And partnering across IT and business, we've seen a couple of use cases where you can do that to inform your content strategy or how you think about data freshness and what the needs are for scalability. We are continuing to invest in community. I mean, you guys are our community. It is because of you that every time I go back from TCA, I go back more inspired. and it's all because of you guys. And there's a dedicated community out in Tableau for server admins specifically, right? So if you are a server admin, if you're in IT, or if you're managing a server, a lot of you are sharing a lot of things that are working, things that are not working, tips and tricks, and there's a lot of activity there. I highly encourage you to participate there as well. There are a lot of other sessions that are happening later today. Look for Tableau Server, Services Manager sessions, sessions on Linux. Some of them already happened, some are going to happen, so look for those, and scalability as well. There's sessions on scalability, TabJolt, and these are the tools, TabMon, that Alan mentioned. So we've left 10 minutes for Q&A, so let's just open up the floor. Go ahead.
What licensing implications do you have when you choose different topologies?
So I'll repeat the question. The question was, what licensing implications do you have when you choose different topologies? Great question.
Great question. I think the way to think about, I mean, I wish there was I usually yield that to a salesperson. I'm not the right guy to answer that question. But architecturally speaking, right, if you're on a core-based model, the boxes will matter. If you deploy it on one physical or virtual box with 8 cores, and that's what you paid for, that's what you got. But then you lose the flexibility of taking the background and moving it to a separate box, right? So some of those things will sort of inform how you work it. I mean, you could split it into 4 cores, but I don't know if that matches the user loads that you have. So I think there's some amount of planning and thought process that goes there. But a lot of customers are also choosing to go the subscription way, right? And if you're going the subscription way or named user license way, the number of cores doesn't matter at that point. So you have the flexibility. And I'm the wrong guy to answer that specifically, but yeah.
The extracts are not encrypted. So how about Hyper? The data will be encrypted?
Great question. So
Yeah.
let me repeat the question. The question was, currently is it true that extracts are not encrypted on disk, and will they be encrypted in the future with Hyper? The answer is yes, that is true. Extracts are not encrypted today. The initial release of Tableau Server using Hyper won't support encryption with Hyper, but we're very excited because with Hyper we get to do things like this, and this is definitely on the roadmap, very important to us, and we're hoping to get to that next year sometime.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say is customers, if you want encryption, just encrypt your disks. That's an easy way to just encrypt the extracts. So everything on the disk is encrypted. That's one way to do it. I've seen a lot of customers do it. You might, I don't know how much perf impact you'll have, but not a whole lot. And I think also when you think about data security, right? My data is secure only if my network is secure. So if I'm worried about data on disk, I want to be worried about other things as well, right? So part of it is just, if your network layers are really locked tight, then you always have new risks, right? That's the world we live in. We have new risks, there's evolving threats, and we take security very seriously, so.
Yeah, but some are like the financial regulation.
Absolutely, yeah. I hear you, yeah. Yeah.
We're talking about the frequency of data refresh. So in 10.3, I think you can only set it at the server level. Is that correct?
So the question was the frequency of data refresh. In 10.3, can you only set it at the server level?
So, you want to take it?
Well, that's a good question. So I know that you can globally change the data refresh setting.
My question is, in the upcoming releases, could we set it at the data source level?
So
Some data sources could be live, some could be like a monthly periodicity of
Yeah,
refresh, and
yeah.
I couldn't find anywhere where I can set that level of.
Well, so the way refreshes work is through background schedules, right? So you create a schedule and you can attach a refresh job to that schedule.
Well, are you talking about caching in the server though? So he's not talking about refreshes. He's talking about the default install. So when you install, how fresh is the viz data, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so what you're asking about is something that we've discussed for years wanting to do. So the granularity of caching today is at the server level. It needs to go to the site level as well. And then we also want to change it to the project, workbook, and user and data source level as well, because we know we want that functionality as well. So I don't know when we're going to do that, but it's important to us. Yeah.
Yeah.
On one of your earlier slides, you mentioned a separate node for a Hyper database. So does that require a separate server, a separate worker for that?
No, so the idea there is
wanna repeat the
wherever
question?
earlier slide, there was a slide that showed hyper on a separate worker. The idea there is not that it needs a separate worker, but it is wherever there's a TDE that we either internally spawn or you have it deployed for extract management, that's where so that could potentially be on the same machine that you had a TDE running on. So, yeah.
So currently
And we'll come back.
set up where we have an equal license, and we have on a single machine now. So what is the recommended number of background rows that we can have on a single machine installation? Because currently we have one, and because of parallel, we have like number of extracts which are parallel processing. So with one background row, it only runs one at a time. So for D4 machine, is there a recommended number of background rows that we should have, or we should not have more than that?
Yeah. And so the question was on a single box, how many backgrounders can I have? What the recommendation is. Never put more backgrounders than the number of cores you have on a box, right? Just don't do it. The other thing I would say is that you're right. The backgrounder it's designed to use up the entire core, right? Because we're optimizing for data freshness. So if somebody says, refresh the data at this time, like we want to make sure that that data is refreshed. So a lot of that, the core does get used up. Now the question really is for you guys, how much impact will it have on your end users who are also running analytics, right? So I don't.
Like scheduling and extracts on a nightly basis so that it doesn't impact.
Correct. That's a good best practice.
Users are running.
Yep.
So
Yeah, that's a good best practice, but just scheduling the extracts at nighttime, right? And you may, depending on the growth you have, you may or may not be able to finish all the extract refreshes at night.
right.
So at some point, you're going to have to think about how do I expand that out, right? But to get the most out of it, I would say definitely not more than the number of cores you have. Go maybe 1/4, right? 1/4 or half the number of cores, and the decision you make will have a different impact on the end user performance. So that's the trade-off you'll make.
So on his box, you could have, you got 8 cores, you could run.
Pardon me, I cannot hear you. I apologize.
In his, where it was 8 cores, you could run 4 background processes on there and you feel comfortable with that.
You could, and it just will have a varying impact on the end user analytics depending on what they're doing. I'm going to go here and then I'll come back right to you. Sorry.
You mentioned the nested projects.
Uh-huh.
Is it flexible, like when you go from a priority to Simplify, can you reorganize as part of the effort? Or do you create like brand new projects and then migrate if you want to reorganize?
So the question was, how flexible is migrating to the new nested project structure? And that's a great question. I would encourage you to go down to the data playground to the labs section, and there is a kiosk there that's devoted to content.
Yeah.
The experts on nested projects are there, and that's a great question to ask, because I don't think there's any affordance that will automatically spread out your projects automatically or anything. I think you'll have to create them from scratch, but talk to those folks.
Yeah. You have site import export that you can use, but we won't know how many levels of projects you need to create, so we really have no idea how to move those in. But I think it's a really good question. We can explore that. Yes, absolutely. And we'll go here, and then, sir, we'll come back to you. Yeah.
My question is about managing user accounts. So I have a customer who is scaling really quickly. They have subscription for named user, not core licensing. They sync their user groups to add new users through Active Directory.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that it's an enterprise company, so Active Directory is constantly adding a shit ton of users and groups. So to manage the number of active users and not just users who are being given licenses that are just dead.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a tool for enterprise level that can manage that out of the box other than digging through the data in the Postgres and looking for who's signed in recently and then trying to go to those accounts and then unsubscribing and trying to figure a way to do it a little bit more systematically?
Yeah, so the question is, do we have a way to support a more flexible onboarding of users with Active Directory that doesn't just automatically add everyone, without having to kind of dig under the hood. And unfortunately, the answer is I can't think of a tool that we provide that would just out of the box fix that solution. But we do have REST APIs to add users, and we do have access to the metadata so that you can kind of see who's active and eventually get it done. But you would have to write some scripts to do that. So, yeah.
So I think, Alan, one thought I had was the AD sync script. I mean, I think, so we always look at AD as the source of truth, right, in an organization. So whatever's in AD, right? I don't want to have stuff that's not in AD on Tableau Server unless you, by design, are looking at external users, or you have, there's a business need. Now, there is an automatic AD sync that runs on schedule within Tableau that just brings your whatever 80 groups are into Tableau. And that might be an approach that might work for that customer, but the deltas are harder.
Yeah,
right?
if they can set up a group in AD that's just the active users, maybe you could just sync that automatically, and that's basically functionality built in. So.
Yeah.
So considering resources, you wonder would it make sense to put over to a Postgres server to another server, or a Postgres engine to another server? And is there any licensing implications by moving it to another server?
So it's a good question. The question is, are there any resource reasons and kind of a point in time when you know you need to move Postgres to another worker? And the answer is, it really depends. So typically, Postgres is not a bottleneck in terms of processing unless you're just hammering your server with thousands of concurrent users, and they're all applying permissions and doing a whole bunch of uploading, publishing all at the same time. And typically with a single machine install, your user base and your actual concurrency is lower than hitting that Postgres threshold where that's an issue. But once you get to a certain level, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of actual concurrency, then we do recommend having Postgres on a separate machine just to take it away. And if you have core licensing, as long as you're within your core quota, it doesn't matter. If you have user licensing based, it doesn't matter at all. You can use as many machines as you want. So, right here.
So I'm glad you asked that question. I have a similar question about web front end. I'm thinking more from the security perspective of having the web interface in a DMZ that we don't even have to VPN in to get at, and then have that separate from where our data is living on the server from a security perspective. Is there a model that makes sense there to have a web front end?
So the question is, do we support DMZs in terms of putting the application server, the content server in a DMZ, and the data actually behind the DMZ? So technically, as long as the correct ports are open between the workers and the machine, you can do that. But Tableau Server requires a fair number of ports to be opened, and we do document them. So if you just search for what ports does Tableau Server require, you can see that. Yeah. And so technically what you're describing is possible, but oftentimes DMZs are locked down much to a further extent than you would expect, because the number of ports we require between workers is fairly large. So there have been some challenges there. But in theory, and we do certainly have customers that do that, we're just going to run viz portal processes in the DMZ and only run the data engine and Postgres on other workers. Yeah, I mean, we have the flexible UI and command line tools to allow those topologies to exist. So.
I would love to see a white paper on that particular topic, because that's what my security guys are asking for right now.
Yep. It's good feedback. I think that would be a lot of people would like that. So thank you for that. Was it over here, I think?
Yeah, the question I had was with regards to high availability. I know yesterday you guys alluded to changing the allotment of server nodes and not requiring a reboot. Are there anything else or other best practices in terms of upgrade schedules or server configurations that would impact the availability of the server?
Yeah, so the question is, it was noticed that adding workers or removing workers requires downtime because it requires a Tableau Server restart. The question is, when else is downtime required, and when are restarts required, and what's changing in that regard? So first of all, it's a problem that we want to solve because we don't like ourselves having to restart server all the time. We don't want you to ever have to do that. We want zero downtime as close to that as we can get. The Tableau Services Manager I've mentioned a few times, one of the reasons it was created is to support zero downtime. Initially, it supports changing the topology of vSQL Server and backgrounder processes, so you can add vSQL Server and add backgrounders or remove them without needing a restart at all. And we're going to take that to all processes eventually, and to worker additions and subtractions as well. But it'll take a few releases before that comes online, but that's definitely in the roadmap. Right here?
So on the slide where you showed the recommendations, or make recommendations, will it make recommendations as to what data might be better served through an extract?
Yeah, because we're looking at the data model, right? So when you say extract, not locally on the desktop.
Well, like if the query, if it is designed to hit a live connection.
Yes.
But
So that's live, right?
but
Yeah.
converting it to an extract would be more efficient, and we'll make that recommendation.
Yeah, so for recommendations to work, you want to have published data sources that are on the server, right? And if they're extracted, if they're embedded, so you can embed an extract. In that case, recommendations doesn't know because it's embedded as part of the whole workbook. But if it's not embedded, then yes, it'll still work.
So we're over time.
Yeah, we're over time. We're
we'll
just
take
doing Q&A, guys. I think we need a...
one more question.
Yeah.
Anyone? Yeah.
Give us a situation where you have your Tableau server and you want to add a worker. I actually want to add a couple of workers, but you can only get one on at this time. And you put two backgrounds with a worker. Would it be okay to leave the other two workers or background on the primary? And if so, can you prioritize those so you use the workers, the background of the worker rather than on the primary?
So the answer is if you add a worker and you had backgrounders running on the primary before and you add a new worker and you want to add backgrounders to that, would it be okay to have backgrounders running on both? And can you prioritize work around the two? So the answer to the first question is yes, it's okay to have backgrounders on multiple machines. At this point in time, you cannot do what you're asking as far as, hey, okay, now we've brought the second worker online. We want to ignore the first set of backgrounders and just have the new backgrounders take the load. We don't allow that configuration yet, but that kind of flexibility is where we want to go. So, yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's not built in yet, but that's something we want to do for sure. So, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thanks, guys. And we'll be at the Tableau Labs, the Data Village. If you have more questions. Thank you.